So today I'm going to be walking through how to make this tie strap dress with a shirred back. I also have this pattern available as a regular top and a jumpsuit, and all of those patterns are available on my store, which is linked down below. I've tried to keep everything as beginner friendly as possible, and I think that's everything, so let's get on with the tutorial. So this is everything that you're going to need for this particular project. You will need a woven fabric. I'm using cotton poplin. This is optional, but I'm going to be adding a trim to my straps and my pockets using this peek out elastic. You could use elastic, you could use lace, you could use any trim that you want really, or you can leave the trim off altogether. You will need some matching thread, some pins, a tape measure and a ruler. You will need some shirring elastic, some fabric scissors or a rotary cutter, some fabric pens or tailor's chalk, and an iron. So I'm going to be using two sewing machines for this project. My regular machine, which is one of the Singer heavy duty machines, and my overlocker. You may also know of this as a serger, and I'm using the Brother Lock 734DS. This is optional. If you don't have one of these, don't worry, you can just use the zigzag stitch on your regular machine instead. So for this project, I'm going to be using the dress version of my Flora pattern, and this pattern has 3 pieces. So I have pattern piece 1, which is the front of the top. You will need to cut 2 of these out, and you will need to cut these on the fold. I have pattern piece 2, which is the back of the top. Again, you will need to cut 2 of these, and again, you will need to cut them on the fold. And then finally, I have pattern piece 3, which is the skirt. You will need to cut 2 of these out on the fold, and then you will also be cutting out some pockets and some straps, but I haven't provided pattern pieces for those so that you can decide on the shape and size of those yourself. So the next step is going to be to cut your pattern pieces out, but first you want to make sure that your fabric is laid out correctly. So you want to find the selvage edge of your fabric, and this is the finished edge of your fabric, and this doesn't fray very easily, but your raw edges do, which will be your easiest way to tell the difference. I'll just zoom in slightly so that you can see the difference in how they look. So this is my selvage edge here, and these are my raw edges, and you can see these are fraying quite easily. So you want to find the 2 selvage edges of your fabric. You'll have 2 on your fabric, and fold the piece so that those selvage edges sit one on top of the other. So then you should have a selvage edge here and a fold on this side. So now I can start to lay my pattern pieces out. So all of my pattern pieces for this project are going to line up to the fold. So it's just going to be a simple case of lining them up and drawing them out. Generally with pattern pieces, you want to find this grain line up the center, and you want to make sure that that is parallel to the selvage edge before drawing them out. But because these are all lined up to the fold, that grain line will be parallel to the selvage edge by default. So I'm just going to start to lay my pieces out and draw them in place. And it will be exactly the same process for the skirt as well. So once those pieces are all drawn in place, I'm just going to take some pins and pin within the lines that I've drawn. That's just going to make sure that when you start to cut these pieces out, both of the layers of fabric stay together. It's going to make sure that you get an accurate shape on both sides of the fabric. So once those pins are in place, you can go in and cut those pieces out. Just being careful to always make sure that you are cutting through 2 layers of fabric. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut out all of my remaining pieces. And once you've cut everything else out, you will have 2 final things to cut out. Firstly, your straps. Like I said, these can be as long or as wide as you want them, but I like to go with 2 inches wide and 15 inches long. You will need 8 of these in total, and obviously I am cutting these out on a double layer again, so I only need to draw 4 of these out. And I'm going to cut these out in the same way as I did with all of my other pieces, just putting some pins in there and then cutting them out. And you will also need to draw out some pieces for your pockets, which again, you can do whatever shape or size you want. But for me, I'm doing 8 inches wide and 10 inches long. And I like to make sure that that long edge is parallel to the selvage edge, and that's the same with the straps as well. And you will need 2 pieces for your pockets. And again, I am cutting these out on a double layer of fabric, so I've only got 1. So I'm going to go ahead and finish cutting out all these pieces, and then I'll show you all of the pieces that you should have at this stage. So this is everything that you should have for your top. So I've got 2 pieces for the back of my top, 8 pieces for my straps, and 2 pieces for the front of my top. And then for my skirt, I have 2 pocket pieces and 2 pieces for my skirt. I would recommend keeping the skirt folded for now because it makes it a little bit easier to add the pockets down the line. So now I can move on to my construction. So the first thing I'm going to do is make my straps. So if you want to make a strap without the trim, you just want to take 2 of your pieces and lay them right sides facing together, one on top of the other, and you're going to pin along both of those long edges and the short edge. If you want to add a trim, it's going to be very similar. You just want to line up that trim to those long edges, and again place your second piece with the right sides facing together with that elastic, and then I'm just going to pin that in place through the elastic so that it sits in the right place. So once that edge is pinned in place, you just want to do the same with your other piece of the trim. So just sandwiching it between those 2 layers and pinning in place. And then the final pin I'm just going to put in place is at one of these ends. Don't really need to do that, but that's just going to remind me where I want to sew. So now whether you are adding a trim or not, you want to sew these in the same way. So just down both of those long edges and along one of the 2 short edges. We're going to leave the other short edge open so that we can use that to turn the strap to the right side out. I'm going to use an overlocker just because I find it easiest when I'm adding elastic like this, but you can also just use a straight stitch. So once those edges are all sewn in place, I'm just going to turn this to the right side out. So once that strap is turned to the right side out, and I've just given mine a bit of a press, I'm just going to add a top stitch. So I'm going to take a straight stitch and sew just down both of those long edges. This is optional, you can skip this step if you want to, but I just find it helps keep those straps sitting nice and flat. So this is how that top stitch is looking. And then once you've done that, you can go in and repeat for all of your remaining straps so that you have 4 in total. And now I'm going to put these to one side and start to work on the front of the top. So the first thing that I need to do with the front of my top is to add my darts. So darts are just a way to add a bit more shape to your garment, and this is the dart here if we look on the paper pattern piece. So we need to transfer this dart onto both sides of the pattern piece because obviously it was cut on a fold, and the easiest way to do this is just going to be to cut that triangle out. And I'm just going to line that up and start to draw that dart in place. You want to be drawing this onto the wrong side of your fabric if your fabric has an obvious right or wrong side. And you're just going to flip the pattern and draw it onto the other side as well. So once both of those darts are drawn in place, you now want to create the folds that are going to give this dart the shape. So I'm going to fold with right sides facing together down the centre of that dart. And just zoom in slightly. So now I'm just going to pin along this line. These lines are called the legs of the dart, and I want to try and match up those lines on either side. So I'm going to start with a pin just down at this point here. And then once you've got those pins in place, you just want to check that the pins go through the line on this side, but when you flip that dart, they also go through the line on this side. So I'm just going to repeat that for my dart on the other side. And once you've added those pins on both sides, I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and sew those darts in place. So I've just got my machine set to a straight stitch and I'm using a length of 2.5. I'm going to take that first pin out and line it up under my needle. I'm just going to start to sew along that line. Just reverse at the top. And take out that next pin. And then as I'm coming to the end here, I'm just going to sew straight off the end. I'm not going to reverse. And then you want to trim that off, but you want to leave long enough tails that we can tie a knot here. And then just going to tie a couple of knots to secure those stitches. And then once you have finished with this dart, you just want to repeat for your second dart. And once those darts are sewn in place, I'm just going to press them flat. I like to press mine towards the armhole. Do the same on this side. And then you just want to repeat all of those steps for the second piece of the front of the top so that you have two identical pieces. And now I'm going to go on to prepare the back of the top. The first thing that I'm going to do with the back of the top is to just add a guide to help us to attach the straps later on. So if you have a look at the pattern, you should see a mark here that is going to show you where the straps should go roughly. So I'm just going to mark that onto both sides of this piece. And obviously you'll want to flip it because it was cut on the fold. So I'm just going to start by drawing out my spacing for my shirring. So I've got my tape measure here. I'm just going to start by measuring 1.5 centimeters from the top and just marking that in place. And then I'm just going to mark in 1 centimeter spacing down from there. And as you get to the bottom here, you want to leave a bit of a gap for seam allowance. So 1.5 centimeters is good, or 2 centimeters, just anything that's a little bit more than the 1 centimeter seam allowance. Now I'm going to go in and repeat this on the other side seam. Now that I've got that guide added to both sides, I'm just going to join up each dot with a line. And this should all be going onto the right side of the fabric. So that's the marks for the straps and the marks for the shirring. So you want to make sure that you're using either tailor's chalk or a fabric pen that can come off easily. So this is water soluble, for example. I'm just going to carry on drawing these lines until I reach the final mark. And now that all those lines are in place, I'm going to take this over to my machine and add that shirring. If you're new to shirring, you might want to practice on some scraps first. So when you're adding shirring, the most important thing is going to be setting up your machine correctly. So I have the top of my machine set up as normal with my needle threaded as I normally would. And I'm going to set my length to the longest length of my machine, which is a 4, and I want this to be a straight stitch. And now I'm just going to take my shirring elastic, I just buy this on Amazon, and I'm going to wind it around that bobbin by hand. You don't want to do this on your machine. Just wind it around there, trying not to stretch it too much. And then once you've got a full bobbin, you just want to load it into your machine as you would with any other bobbin. And just pick that up with my thread and pull it out of the way. And now it's just a case of sewing along each of your lines. And I'm going to reverse at the start and end of each line. So that's my first line done, and you can see that the piece is already starting to gather. The more lines that you sew in place, the smaller your piece will become. I'm going to go ahead and sew the rest of my lines off camera, but just follow along each of those straight lines. The shirred panel should roughly half in length. If it doesn't, you may need to change some of the settings on your machine. So this is how that back panel should look once you've finished adding your shirring. It should be nice and stretchy. And you want to go in and repeat that for your remaining piece of the back so that you have two identical pieces. And now that I've finished preparing all of my individual pieces, I'm going to go back to finish the front of the top. So now I'm going to take the two pieces of the front of my top and lay them one on top of the other with right sides facing together. And I'm going to pin around the armhole on both sides. And I'm going to sew both of those armholes in place with a straight stitch. So now that those armholes are in place, I'm going to add my straps. I'm also just going to trim off the excess of this dart. So I'm going to take 2 of my 4 straps, just start with one here, and I'm just going to place it between the 2 layers of the front of my top. And I'm going to line it up next to that armhole that we've just sewn in place. I like to have a bit of mine peeking over the top of the neckline, just to make sure that when we sew them in place, that you don't miss anything. So firstly, I'm just going to pin that. I'm going to do the same with this strap. And then once those straps are pinned in place, I'm just going to pin the rest of the way along that neckline. And now I'm going to sew straight across the top of this neckline with a straight stitch, just being careful to make sure that you get both layers of the top and make sure that you get those straps as well. And once that neckline is sewn in place, the front of the top is done. The only other thing that you might want to do is to just follow around these edges with an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, but I only find you really need to do that if you're using a fabric that frays quite easily. So I'm going to put this to one side for now and work on the back of the top. So now I'm going to add these straps to the back of my top. So I want to find the guide that I added earlier, which should be on the right side of your fabric. And I'm just going to find the center of the strap and pin that to the guide. Again, I'm just going to put the strap just above where that top ends. And I'm going to do the same with my second strap. And I'm going to take the second piece of my back panel and lay it on top of all those pieces with right sides facing together. I'm just going to pin it in place at a couple of points. You won't be able to pin it right along the top edge like you did with the front of the top, because this piece is going to have to be stretched as you sew it. So I'm going to start with the edge over here. And then I'm going to pin all the way through the straps, just lining up the guide on this top piece. And pin all the way through. And then you can take out the pin in the middle. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. And then I'm just going to place a pin roughly at the center as well. And now I'm going to take this over to my machine and sew that edge in place. So I'm just going to sew along this top edge with a straight stitch, just stretching as I go. So I'm just going to reverse at the start here. And then whenever you stretch, you want to make sure your needle is down in the fabric. I'm just coming over that strap now. And then come into that second strap. Just make sure that those straps are facing down all the time. And then just reverse in at the end here. Once that top edge is sewn in place, I'm going to turn this piece to the right side out. And it should look something like this. Now we can combine the front and the back of the top. So I've got the front of my top here, which should still be inside out, and then the back of the top wants to be the right way out, and I'm going to place the back of the top inside the front of the top. You'll see the back of the top will be a lot smaller than the front of the top now until you stretch it. So now I'm going to start to match up these side seams. I'm going to start to pin them in place. I'm going to start on this side. Just start to match up those 4 layers. I like to do the 2 most extreme points first. This will probably be one of the most fiddly parts of the whole construction. It's not particularly difficult. It might just take you a little bit of time. So now that I've got these pins in place, I'm going to go in and repeat the same thing for the other side seam. So this is roughly how your top will look once both of those side seams are pinned in place. As you can see, it will kind of bunch together because of how much smaller the back piece is than the front. So don't panic if yours looks like this. This is how it should look. So now I'm going to take a straight stitch and just sew straight down both of those side seams, just being very careful to make sure you get all 4 layers of your fabric in that seam. It can be very easy to just lose one of those layers, especially the ones with the shirring. It's quite easy for them to pull out the way. So just be very careful as you do that. And once those side seams are sewn in place, you can turn the top to the right side up. Your top should be looking at something like this, and now I'm going to move on to make the skirt. So I'm going to start by working on my pockets. I'm going to be adding a trim like I did with the straps, but this is optional. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to just overlock around my edges, and I'm going to add that elastic to the top edge as well. If you don't have an overlocker, you can also use a zigzag stitch, and of course if you don't want to add a trim, just leave that off. And now that I have finished off those edges, I'm just going to take the trim, which I forgot to mention, you should sew that to the right side of your fabric if your fabric has an obvious right or wrong side. And I'm just going to fold it to the wrong side, and I'm going to press that in place. So it should be looking something like this with the trim just kind of peeking up above the pocket opening. I'm just going to take a straight stitch and sew along this top edge to keep that elastic nice and flat. And then once that top stitch is in place, you want to hem the rest of those edges. So I'm just going to fold the edge towards the wrong side of the fabric and press it in place. I'm going to aim for a hem of about 1 centimetre, but you don't need to be too precise with this. So your pocket should be looking something like this. If you weren't adding a trim, you would simply just fold this edge over like you have with the others and top stitch it in place. You don't need to stitch any of the other edges in place because we're going to sew those to the skirt. And you want to repeat all of those steps for your second pocket piece as well, so that you've got 2 identical pieces. And now I can start to add this to the skirt. So as I've said, I like to keep my skirt folded in half when I add my pockets. And I'll show you why in a second. I just find it much easier to line up the pocket on both sides. So firstly, I'm just going to find roughly where I want that pocket to sit, and then I'm going to pin it in place. So I'm just going to pin around these 3 edges that we haven't yet sewn. And obviously you only want to pin this through 1 layer of the fabric. And once you've got those pins in place, I'm just going to take a couple of rough measurements so that we can more easily match up the other side. So from the top corner here, it's about 9.5 centimetres, and down to the top corner is about 27. So 9.5 and 27 is what we're aiming for. So now I'm just going to flip it over. And the first thing I'm going to do is just try and feel for where my first pocket is, which generally gets it in pretty much the right area. And then before I start to pin it in place, I'm just going to take those measurements again. So that is 27 and 9.5, which is what I was looking for. So now I'm just going to pin this in place in the same way that I did with the other pocket. And then once both of those pockets are pinned in place, I'm just going to sew around those 3 edges with a straight stitch. So just the 2 long edges and the bottom edge. So that's how my pocket is looking. If you find at this stage that your pockets aren't looking very symmetrical, don't worry, it is very easy to unpick them and reposition. So now I'm going to move on to attach the front of the skirt and the back of the skirt together. So I'm just going to take the back of my skirt and place it with right sides facing together with the front of the skirt, and then I'm just going to pin along the side seam on both sides. And once those pins are in place, I'm just going to sew down each side with a straight stitch, and I'm also going to finish off the raw edge with my overlocker, but you can also use a zigzag stitch. And that's how my side seams are looking. So the next thing I'm going to do is just to find some 1/2 and 1/4 points of the waistline of my skirt. That's just going to make it a bit easier when it comes to attaching the top. So firstly, to find the center front, I'm just going to fold the skirt with the side seams one on top of the other. So that will look something like this, and then you've got your center back at this fold here and your center front at the fold on the other side. Just placing a pin at both of those points. And if you want to, you can leave it there and just work with the center front and center back. But I like to split the back of my skirt into quarters, just because when you are sewing that waistline in place with the top, once you get to the back of the top, you will have to stretch as you sew. So the more points that you find for the back of the top, the easier that will be, and the smaller the sections will be that you have to stretch. That will make a bit more sense later on. If it doesn't make sense now, don't worry. But the next point that I'm going to find is I'm just going to fold the center back pin to the side seam and then place a pin at this fold here. And then I'm just going to do the same on the other side as well. So fold in that center back pin to the other side seam. And then again, this fold will become the point where we put the pin. And now the back of my skirt looks like this. So we've got the back of the skirt split into 4 quarters. And then for the front of the skirt, all we've really got is the center pin, which is all we're really going to need for this section. So now that I know where those center points are, I can start to sew my gather lines. I like to work in 2 smaller sections, so 2 halves of my front panel rather than 1 big section, because the longer those gather lines are, the more likely that when we come to pull the threads to gather the piece, that those threads will snap. So I'm going to work in these 2 halves here, and I'm going to sew 2 lines at the top of this waistline on both sides, and I'm going to make sure that I leave nice long tails because we're going to use them to gather the piece. I'll show you how I'm going to do that on my machine. So I've got my machine set to a straight stitch, and I'm going to change the length to the longest length that my machine has, which is a 4. And then you want to make sure that you are focusing on the front of your skirt here, so that will be the piece that's got the pockets. And I'm just going to start to sew along that top edge. And then stop once you get to that pin. Make sure you trim nice long tails, and then I'm going to go back to where I started and sew a second line right below the first line that we sewed. And again, stopping when you get to that pin. Now I'm going to do my second section. So just starting from the pin this time. And ending at the side seam. And then again, go back and sew another line under that first one. And trim it off at that side seam. Hopefully you can just about see those gather lines. So I've got 2 on this side of the pin and 2 on this side of the pin, and then I've got these long tails that we're going to use to gather it. So now I need to start to attach my top to this skirt piece. So now I'm going to find some of those same points for the top that we found for the skirt. So I want to find the center front and center back. So I'm going to fold my top with the side seam one on top of the other, and then I have my center front here, just place a pin there, and my center back here. I'm just going to stretch the top to make sure that that is the accurate center back, which it is. And then I'm also going to find those quarter points. So I'm going to fold the centre back on top of the side seam. And then again, I'm just going to stretch and place a pin. And then the same for the other side. So just fold in so that the centre back meets the side seam. And then stretch that piece and place a pin. So now you have the centre marked for your front panel, and then for your back panel you have the centre back marked, but you also have these quarter marks as well. So you've got 4 quarters for the back of your top. And now that you have those pins in place, you can start to pin this to the waistline of the skirt. So now you want your top to be the right way out and your skirt to be inside out. And I'm just going to place the top inside the waistline of the skirt, making sure that the front of the top, which is the side with the darts, is facing the front of the skirt, which is the side with the pockets. And then I'm just going to start to pin that in place with some of the points that we found. So the centre front of the top to the centre front of the skirt. And take out that extra pin. And I'm also going to pin the side seam of the skirt to the side seam of the top. And the same on the other side. And then I'm just going to flip this so that I can get to the back more easily. And then for the back, we're just going to pin the centre back, the top to the centre back of the skirt. And then just those quarter points as well. So we've got everything pinned in place at the back. And then at the front, you've just got that one centre pin. So now we can start to gather the front of the skirt. So you want to find 2 of those tails and just start to gather that fabric. You can do it from either end. And your goal here is just to make sure that the skirt fits to be the same size as the top. So I like to gather quite roughly to find the right size, which that is the correct size. And then I'm going to tie my threads off, and then I'm going to start to pull around the gathers a bit to make it look a bit more even. And then tie off this side as well. And then, like I said, I'm just going to even out those gathers. And once you're happy with how those gathers are looking, I'm just going to pin that section in place. So that's how it looks once I've got my pins in place. I'm going to go in and repeat the same steps for the other side. So now that I've added all of those pins, I can go ahead and sew my waistline in place. But before I do that, I do like to go in at this point and check that the back of the top is pinned correctly to the skirt. And what I mean by that is that we're going to have to stretch each section of the back to make sure that the top fits nicely into each section of the skirt. So I just like to go in and stretch each section to make sure that those pins are distributed correctly, because it can be quite easy to place those pins slightly wrong just because of this shirring in the back panel. And mine all look fine, so I'm going to go ahead and sew this in place. So I've got my machine set to a straight stitch, and I'm just going to put the length back down to 2.5, which is the standard length that I use. I'm going to start by sewing around the front of that waistline, which is pretty straightforward. So now just coming up to the back of the waistline, I'm going to make sure that whenever I stretch, my needle is down in the fabric, and then I'm just going to stretch and sew. and then move to the next pin and stretch and sew. And then I've got my final section here, stretch. And then I'm just going to join up to where I started. Now I'm just going to go in with an overlocker and clean up that raw edge. You can also do that with a zigzag stitch. You'll just need to trim off some of these threads as well. And once you've finished off that waistline, you can turn your dress to the right side out. So now the only thing left to do is to finish off this bottom edge. I'm going to be adding a ruffle. If you want to do the same, I have a dedicated tutorial for that, which I will link down below. Otherwise, you can just do a standard double hem. So I would fold the edge towards the wrong side once, and then fold it again, and then press that in place. And then you can just sew that in place with a straight stitch. And once you've finished off that bottom edge, then the dress is finished.